Couple things here. We did just get the Jeep running a second ago, so come on in here. So last I left off, we checked the crankshaft position sensor. Now, today I started with testing the coil. Before I did that, I wanted to just take a look at the fuses. I probably should have done that from the start. I pulled open the fuse in the engine bay, and I noticed that there was, in this 15 amp for ignition, there was a 10 amp fuse in there. Not a 15 amp. There was a 10 amp fuse. I pulled it out and it was busted, totally blown in half. So I replaced it. I took the 15 amp fuse from the aux lamps in there and I swapped it over to the ignition section, but it didn't make any difference. Things still didn't start, just didn't do anything. But that may have led to the actual issue. So then what I went to do is it ended up being the ignition coil. So what I did to test it, is I wanted to make sure that I still wasn't sure that the crankshaft position sensor and the camshaft position sensor were sending enough signal to the ignition coil. So what I did, I'm coming over to this other Jeep. I have 3 of the same Jeeps right now, so it's kind of easy for me just to pull parts to test stuff. But what I did before I pulled any parts is on this, if you can look down in this crack in between, it's going to be right in here. You should see a red and yellow little electric connection. See that? You need the light down there. You see it at all or no?
No. Oh.
There it is. So this little guy, this is the electrical connection for your ignition coil. Man, some better light down here for you. There it is. This is what it looks like. This plugs into your ignition coil like that with this little clip up top. So the wire on the right hand side right now that my thumb is next to covering, that plug should be a 12 volt constant. You can back probe stuff, or you can just I unclipped it and I shoved my multimeter lead, the red lead in that right side. I shoved the red lead to the multimeter in that right side, and then I stuck the black lead on any sort of a ground, the black lead on the negative side of the battery, and I stuck it to DC volts. So once you turn the car in ignition, you turn the key over, you should have 12 volts constant to that right side, or that, depending on where you are, it's the side closest to the fender, the passenger side fender. That should be 12 volt constant. And then, if you have 12 volts there, you take this out and go to the other side, go to the one that's closer to the engine block, that hole, and then you're still on ground. That, when you crank it over, I had about 10.28 volts going to that terminal. So I wasn't sure if it was supposed to actually be 12 or 10, 12.6, whatever. So I went over to this Jeep and I tested it on this Jeep, and I was getting 12 volts constant to that passenger side, and then I had 10.2 volts when I was cranking to the engine block side. So that let me know that my crankshaft position sensor and my camshaft sensor were both working properly and sending the correct amount of voltage to the coil. So at that point on the other end, I wasn't getting enough spark. I was basically getting a really intermittent, barely any spark, if anything at all. So at that point, I was pretty sure it was the ignition coil. So instead of pulling that ignition coil off, testing it, finding out it was bad, going to get a new part, or taking one off of this Jeep, throwing it on, figuring out it worked, what I did instead was I just pulled the part off of this Jeep, because I don't have to remove the ignition coil to try out the new one. I pulled the ignition coil that I knew was good off of my working Jeep, and I just simply plugged it in. If you look down here, here's the old ignition coil. You can see it right there. It's still bolted on. This is the one off my working Jeep. I just plugged in the wire connection on the backside, and I plugged in the spark plug lead to the coil right here. So, and it doesn't have to be grounded as far as I can tell. I looked it up online and I couldn't find anything that said you need to ground it. I didn't ground it, but we're gonna go ahead and fire it up right now, and we'll see what it does. I'm not running it for too long like this, but it's fired up right now. wires up pretty nicely, doesn't knock, runs pretty smooth. So, and I think these plug wires are newer. I think it said Summit on them. I'm not sure when they were replaced, but it seems okay. At this point, I know it's the ignition coil. We had weak spark. That's usually an indication of a bad ignition coil. So I'm either gonna go to a junkyard and grab a new one of these, depending on, or maybe I'll go to a parts store and grab a new ignition coil, if it's cheap enough. So how to get your ignition coil off? It's kind of a pain in the butt on this thing, surprise, surprise, but it is these 10mm bolts, but unfortunately there's a nut on the back side. So the orientation is like this, bolted onto the side of your engine block. Wires come in this way from the front, and the plug goes out to the distributor here. Now these go through here like this, and then it goes through a bracket, and then on the back side with about 1/4 of an inch of room in between the engine block, you've got to slide on this nut here. And then you've got to somehow hold this while you're also cranking this down. So what I did was just grab a 10mm box end wrench, stick it on there like this with the bent side facing towards me to be able to get it down in there, and then just lefty-loosey or righty-tighty here. There's not a ton of room. I had to use a little bit of a wobble socket to get to it in some areas, but that'll get it off. It's gonna be a pain. You're gonna end up having to reach around there to try to hold this thing a million different ways with your box end wrench before you actually can get this off. So that's how it is done. And something that I noticed here when I was just looking at this guy is that this ignition coil is actually really cracked and broken. And it just looks like the rubber. I don't know if it makes a big difference, but all the way from here over to there is a big crack. There's another crack here, and on the back side, the entire thing is cracked as well. So it still seems to work okay, but I might end up replacing both of them rather than putting this thing back in. So we're gonna go get 2 new ignition coils, and then we'll move on from there.